all of your books are extremely steeped in the maker movement.
They are. Yeah.
You know, they're also steeped in AI and deep concepts about the future of society and freedom and so on. But maybe tell us a little bit, just so people who haven't read the books know a little bit to give us context for the conversation.
Well, sure. Okay, Daemon and Freedom TM, there's two books. I really wrote them as one. And I wrote them back around 2004, 2006. It's when I first self-published Daemon. And the high concept was essentially, it's going to sound familiar, the high concept, which is you have a game designer who's dying of cancer, and he leaves behind a program that starts to exert his will after his death, that type of thing. But a lot of what I wanted to get at in these books was to kind of start with a very scary premise and make it very realistic using realistic technology. And that's why I had a lot of real hacking in it, a lot of real physical objects and how they were created. I wanted to make it seem menacing because I knew at that time that that's a good way to sell a thriller, to pull people in. And then I wanted that second book to be really the payload for the story, to bring it in a much more positive direction. This idea of remaking the world, it's not all about tearing things down. And so in that sense, I think the books, I would have been, if Maker had existed at the time, I would have been expressing it in that way. Because really this was this idea of not tearing down a system, but building new ways of living, new ways of arranging society, new ways of connecting with each other.
One of the things, apart from the deep, sort of rich science and maker texture of your books, there's a fairly unique social sensibility. You know, you have, you're kind of at this curious tipping point where you're thinking very differently about society. You know, we have people, libertarians in the tech industry, who are like, oh yeah, let's get rid of the way it is and let everybody build this something new. But you also have a deeply humane sensibility, a sense of the importance of you know, our sort of civic mindedness and our working together. There's often characters in your books who work for the government. Some of them are bad guys, some of them are feckless, some of them are incredibly devoted, you know, public servants putting their life on the line to try to serve the rest of us. It's kind of a very interesting, nuanced view of society. Can you talk just a little bit about that? Well,
I suppose I look at our society, humanity, that as a bell curve, that the great majority of people really do want society to work. They get something out of it. And so that's why I really tried not to make any one individual group of characters either be villainous, and even those that are villainous in my books are sometimes, you know, shades of gray. But I think the thing that I would take out of my books, the things that I was certainly trying to put in them, was that community works because people want it to. And so we can trust each other to some degree. It's only on the margins where people are either excessively greedy or excessively giving. And really, in the main, if people are left to their own devices, they can create some very enduring and sustainable communities. And that's what I wanted to explore in these books. It's the idea that, you know, you don't need top-down control.
Right. So again, in this first pair of books, you end up having a fairly post-apocalyptic almost situation with an out-of-control AI, but then you actually have something come out of it that's very, very different, a new kind of society. And in a lot of ways, that's, you know, kind of a vision of the, you know, self-reliant maker movement is part of that. There's also this sort of whole notion of the dark net and how people are, you know, communicating and organizing in new ways.
But notice that you said AI, and I get you, but it was very explicit in these books that we've seen a lot of science fiction where there's a generalized AI out of control, and really what I was doing here was I was trying to show a narrow AI, an AI that is little more than a really elaborate macro that reacts to what happens in the news. And what I was trying to get at there was, again, people are making their own relationship with this AI, and they're setting up new social structures around it and beginning to rely on each other more. And then notice as the book goes further on and on, people rely less directly on that AI, narrow AI, and more on the new structures that they've established with its assistance in a way.
Yeah. So when you think about the various technologies that are shaping our future, I know that you have kind of some deep threads that you think about. There's the maker movement, but there's also how intellectual property is changing, how networks are changing. You're very interested in digital currency. Can you kind of weave a story about how all these fit together in your mind?
Yeah, well, certainly in my books, I was very interested in 3D printing and the idea of having resilient local communities. And of course, lo and behold, here we are years later, and a lot of this is starting to come into fruition. Now, I view it as four components, like you're saying. The makers, the skills and the tools, I think that's happening now, as evidenced by how many people are here this weekend. And this is, it's just the zeitgeist right now, the idea of having some control over how you consume and create things. But I do see, and I wrote this in the books, that you need several other components to truly make it global, to make it the common experience of everybody. And I would think the first one of those we're starting to see shades of it, is the intellectual property situation with regard to 3D printing and scanning. Now, I wonder whether that's going to follow the same route that music did, whether the music business, they resisted digital change. And I wonder if manufacturing has learned something from that, the global manufacturers, whether or not we can envision a very different way of buying and selling and creating things.
There's an argument, certainly, that certain areas of manufacturing are very fast-moving already. Think about fashion, for example, where intellectual property is just less relevant because, hey, you're done in 6 weeks.
Yeah. By the time you figured out whatever legal issues, they've already moved on.
Yeah, and I do wonder if some ways the speed of technology and the speed with which we're able to make new things is actually going to make some of that moot. But certainly there are classic areas where I think intellectual property is going to still be a battleground, and there's no question that big companies work government to put in place the rules that are good for them, not necessarily good for innovation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think if you get into a situation where a very popular product, somebody scans it and improves it, it would be my preference that companies realize that that's crowdsourcing design and that's going to help them. It's going to help them do mass customization on all of these things. And I hope that what they won't do is turn around and sue people who do that.
Yeah, well, in fact, there's a really interesting, connection between crowdsourced design and this kind of new world of manufacturing. Because in fact, we're creating for each other at all levels so much more of our own entertainment, for example. You think about the old age of mass-produced media, and now what are we doing? We're sitting there looking at Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and we're entertaining each other. That's right. Sharing things, telling stories, sharing our pictures. And increasingly with the maker movement, we're, and you look outside, people are saying, look what I made.
Yeah.
And, people are paying to come see it.
Yeah, and it's crowded. That's the other thing that really makes me excited is it's very popular. So, I just hope that manufacturers world over start to go with this movement. Don't resist it. I mean, I've read a few articles recently showing that they're, like you said, lobbying to try to get DRM built into various machines from the get-go to try to keep people from scanning and freely sharing shapes.
Yeah, I do think overall there's always an arms race between creators and people who are trying to lock down property. I mean, it's always been true, but creativity does tend to win out in the end.
Well, one more thing about that. When you have a design, let's say a CAD design, and that's a digital construct, and there's a numerical way you could measure whether it's changed or not. And it always struck me as that it would be useful if people could measure the degree to which that design has changed and reward the people appropriately. You know what I'm saying? If you are the original creator of that design and somebody else changes it 27% from the original plan, I mean, computers allow us to measure that. It's not an opinion.
Although, yes and no, because the difference you know, as the Mark Zuckerberg character famously said in the movie The Social Network, if they had built Facebook, they would have built Facebook.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean, the fact is sometimes the differences between something being and something being
amazing
yeah. are actually, you know, hard to measure.
True.
And, you know, what are those critical innovations that make the difference? I don't think we really know. But, you know, and there's also some arbitrary aspect of it. You know, I don't know if you've ever seen the studies about where they've kind of created sort of little artificial worlds in which things basically become hits because they're hits, you know, and in 6 different universes, the hits are completely different because of it's really just a dynamic of things become popular and they get heard more and more people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
unpredictable.
Yeah. So you know, let's sort of jump a little bit onto the. You talked about this idea that we need local and regional networks as civic infrastructure.
Yeah.
So, you know, how do you think about that? I mean, that's a fairly unusual idea. Everybody sits there and thinks, well, the internet is everything, everybody. You're saying we need a somewhat different network topology.
Well, yeah, again, to tie it back to the books, Daemon and Freedom TM, the first thing that the creator of that system did was create a new network. He did not rely upon the internet, and in this case, he used ultra-wideband.
Yeah.
But the idea of creating local mesh networks or networks that are, you know, using a different technology, basically, we have a society where we have different levels of political organization, for instance. Now, the internet, if we look at it, it's global, immensely useful, but I do think we need to start thinking about regional and local networks as well, and either, whether they be mesh networks or completely different networks that don't go through, let's say, the fiber optic grid, that really reward more local commerce and local organization.
Yeah. So, for some reason, I'm not sure why I'm thinking of this because it's diverting from the script. I'm jumping ahead to your book, Kill Decision, and which is basically about autonomous swarm robots, you know, being weaponized. Yep. Super scary.
Yeah, it's going to be nonfiction shortly, I think.
Yeah, right. It's because that whole thing about, you know, weaponized drones is like freaking, you know, like. There are crazy people out there,
yes,
you know, putting this stuff into reality and not thinking very far ahead.
Yeah, yeah.
But you bring in ants, you know, and there's a whole this sort of the, you know, you kind of there's an entomological backstory to that, and you know you think about ant organization and you know the whole idea that society as we know it is the only way for things to be organized, I think is something we, you know, take for granted. There's some effectively, you know, very, very different, very, very effective ways of organizing, which we see in nature that, you know, may end up coming into play in our networks as well.
That's a good point, because certainly ant colony optimization algorithms are used by companies like, you know, UPS. They're used in network routing. And ant society has been around for 80 to 100 million years. So it's a very durable network. It can deal with a lot. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned there, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're pretty new, you know.
Yes.
Human civilization is a few tens of thousands of years old, and we kind of think of it as the norm.
Yes.
When in fact it's this experiment, and we have no idea how durable it's going to be at all.
And they're the pros.
Yeah. So let's jump on to a little bit onto the topic of digital currency. You're something of a critic of Bitcoin, but you're something of an enthusiast about digital currency.
You know what? I like the idea of Bitcoin. I think the thing that concerns me about it is the idea of burning through an intrinsically valuable resource to get to one that is only theoretically valuable. In this case, speculative. And the speculation, you can see not a lot of people are spending Bitcoins. They're holding on to them, hoping that they'll increase in value, and that makes for not a very good currency of trade. So I am interested in digital currencies from the point of view of having a currency that's inherent in the network you're in. And again, that goes to those differing levels of networks, because if you have a local currency on a local network, you could spend it only locally, and that could help a lot of things from the environment to, you know, having a local middle class, skilled workers, on and on.
Right. Well, there's also kind of the whole notion that a currency is really a fiction that we all agree to believe in.
Yes.
And, why we have to have just one fiction.
Yeah.
Is really interesting. And there are certainly, if you think of what's happening on the internet today as an attention economy, a Facebook like is a kind of currency,
yep.
or a retweet is a kind of currency, and those things actually do add up to, in sort of small and odd ways, convertibility. People, are out there, spending money to get more followers, so they can get more retweets, so they can get more, which actually turns out to be valuable to some people. So it's sort of funny because it isn't just money as we get into networks. And again, I think back to a book, another science fiction book, Cory Doctorow's Down Out in the Magic Kingdom, about a future, a nanotechnology future in which all wants are taken care of. We've gotten, and the currency is something he calls woofy, which is basically
reputation.
Reputation. How much and we have a lot of elements now of a reputation economy. Where people are out there and they're being measured by something that's happening on the network. Whether that's you're getting hired at Google because you have a they can see your network reputation via your GitHub commits, or whether it's you're on YouTube and you're YouTube famous to whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we're in a post-scarcity economy, though. I think there's still plenty of scarcity.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, how do you think the maker movement can change the arc of our economy? One of the things that sort of bothers me a lot in the hand-wringing about the economy today is, we don't have middle-class jobs. But there's the notion there that a job is something that somebody else gives you, versus, I think the sense of autonomy and self-motivation that I think is in the maker movement, where you're looking for things that need doing, things that you can do, and it seems to me that when people are asking about, how will distributed manufacturing or 3D printing create jobs, that's the wrong question. The real question is, how does it enable us to do things that need doing? Yeah. And some of that might be, we get to make things that we sell to each other or share with each other, or it might be self-sufficiency. But how do you see the maker movement and kind of today's real economy?
Well, I think you answered it in the main, which is, again, if you give people the tools to create things for each other and to provide services for each other, they can start to create their own jobs, and they can much more nimbly respond to need, reconfigure what they're making to make it more accessible, better for people who are using it. And again, share those plans with other people around the world, whether they sell them the plans or freely share them as open source hardware. But I was just reading yesterday about I think it was GM that was doing basically open source. It was crowdsourcing design for various parts of a car. The idea being that everybody could submit a design, and the design that was viewed as the best, they would have to produce so many of them. And this would be a constant process. Now, this is not in the main how they do manufacturing, but this was a fairly big company looking down at a grassroots level and saying, how can we leverage that? How can we take the skills that these makers have and try to fold it into what we do as a rapid prototyping tool?
Yeah.
And that right there, those people would all be creating for themselves a livelihood, jobs.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that's an indication of where it's going in the future. When people create and print things individually, that's the simplest form it's going to take. I think it's when people start working in collaborative groups.
But it really strikes me that one of the things that we really have to understand in the maker movement is there's the hands-on part, of, hey, I made it myself. And then there's the technologies that we're working with, whether it's sort of sensors and electronics and robotics and 3D printing and all these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Because it strikes me that as soon as somebody nails it with a product, it stops being seen as maker, and it's just consumer, right?
Yeah.
And there's this sort of cycle. And what drives me when I think about that, in 2003, I think it was, or maybe it was 2000. No, sorry, I take it back. It would have been 2006. We had this guy, Jeff Hahn, at our Emerging Technologies Conference, and he had this big, big screen, multi-touch display, and he was up on stage doing the manipulation stuff that we all now do on our smartphones, but everybody was like, oh my God, that's the coolest thing ever. And it was out of NYU's lab, he was out of, and it was this maker device, and like a year later, everybody had one in their pocket, right, with the iPhone. And all of a sudden, it's no longer maker, it's just like, that's what is. And I do wonder to what extent some of the things that we see.
I think your battery just died.
Could be. Things that we see as maker today will end up being, tomorrow's consumer products, and the maker movement will move on. And for example, DIY bio will be the next frontier, because guess what? Now you just, you have your home replicator.
Well, I think it's going to also be resources. If you take a look at the mass manufacture and the idea of moving stuff 8,000 miles across the world and manufacturing it very cheaply, I think that's going to go away. And of course, there's climate change, which is going to factor into it. Doing very intensive mining and destroying ecosystems. I think there's an end point to that fairly soon. And I think that's going to encourage the maker movement to continue. Again, so if here.
Oh, I hear you. But when you bring up climate change, clearly the political environment doesn't necessarily support the things that common sense would say. When you say that's got to change fairly soon, there's certainly a possibility that certain things that really need to change won't, and we're in for some deep trouble.
Well, that's competition, isn't it? If we don't respond to real situations, other societies will. And that's, so again, the maker movement might continue, but in a different form and elsewhere.
Right, because we'll need it. We'll need it just for resilience. So maybe talk about resilience a little bit.
Well, okay, I guess I was writing about this a while back before it was more commonly known. But in my books, there's a concept of something called a HOLEN, which I actually took from an NSA cryptographer's design. And what a HOLEN is a self-contained unit that is nonetheless informed by other HOLENs around it. So it is independent, but not completely ignorant of its surroundings. And what I wanted to do was, in my books, take that as a concept, as a goal, to create a society where every community was reliant for its critical inputs, let's say food, medicine, energy, in only a 100-mile radius, as a means to try to contain its susceptibility to far-off events beyond their control. But of course, they would have luxury goods and other things that they could get from outside of that HOLEN, because they're not critical to their lives. But my thinking was simply that, and again, a lot of this stemmed from my work in logistics, designing systems. I won't say from which companies, but basically, we wring every ounce of efficiency out of our logistics systems. Every system, energy, networks, all of it is working towards ultimate efficiency, making a very precision machine out of our whole society. And what that does is it introduces a fragility. A precision machine is very fragile. And if something unexpected happens, it tends to crash. It tends to fall apart. And that was actually one of the impetuses for me writing these books. I liked the idea of creating an advanced society that was nonetheless very resilient, that if any surprises happened, it could adapt and quickly adjust. If there were any local problems, they would remain local problems. You wouldn't get into a situation where one of the two manufacturing plants to produce a certain type of chip had a fire. Suddenly, all of these other pieces of equipment, medical equipment, whatever, couldn't be made. So really what I was looking at there was I was trying to envision how that would work. And that the result really was the HOLEN, the idea of local resilience.
Yeah, well, one other form of resilience is just being able to make it yourself. And that is an interesting way the maker movement ties all these themes together. The original Make slogan was, if you can't open it, you don't own it. and that applies to DRM, but it also applies to so many of the things that we use in our lives, and it's so important for all of us to actually have that spirit go, wait a minute, I can fix it because I built it. I know how it works. Listen, I think we're out of time. I'm sorry we didn't cover all the topics we wanted to, but I just really want to urge you, again, Daniel's books are amazing. It's Daniel Suarez on Twitter. Follow him there, and you won't regret it. Thank you.